And the last thing I'll say before we get started is our hope today is to spend about an hour going through the core policy and implementation changes that are included in the Historic Resources Code project. We won't touch on every change that's in this project. What we're really hoping to do is to touch on those changes that will most greatly affect property owners and tenants beginning on March 1st when the code takes effect. And some of the smaller items we're not going to be able to get to today, but staff are happy to answer questions and follow up as we go along. And so with that, I think we'll kick off our lunch and learn and talk a little bit about the project and the specific code changes that are coming down the road on March 1st. And so I mentioned today's presentation won't cover everything included in the Historic Resources Code project, but our hope is that we can give an overview of the most important regulatory changes to the existing code. We're going to take on today's presentation in 5 different segments, and so we're going to track along with those sections in the bottom. First off, we'll start big picture for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with the Historic Code project, talking about what is the Historic Resources Code project, where are we at in implementation. Then we're going to talk a little bit deeper about why the existing code is being changed. We have both state and federal changes that are leading us to make changes to our existing code. We're going to talk about some of the goals of the Historic Resources Code project that were shared by our Planning and Sustainability Commission and City Council throughout the adoption process, and then really spend the bulk of our time talking about what are the changes to the code. And so specifically, we're going to talk in great detail about new exemptions to historic resource review, also known as design review for historic places, but officially called historic resource review, and then talk about other important changes that are being made to the code. And so for those of you who are here because you maybe own or rent a historic building and thinking about small exterior changes, we're going to cover many of those today. If you're interested in some of the bigger policy changes that are coming down the road for demolition or for use of properties, we're going to talk about that as well. Your next slide. Great. So starting us off at sort of the big picture here, on March 1st, so about a week from Monday, many chapters of the city zoning code will be amended to incorporate changes in the Historic Resources Code project. And so March 1st, all the changes I'm talking about today will go into effect. And among the long list of regulatory improvements and changes, these code changes will clarify and streamline existing zoning code, create new exemptions, so items that are not subject to city historic resource review. The changes will streamline the review of specific affordable housing projects in historic and conservation districts, and establish new procedures for demolition of historic resources. And like I mentioned, there's many other related changes in these code amendments. At a high level, we're going to talk about those 4 today, as well as some others. I mentioned earlier, we will not have, we're going to save questions until the end. We probably won't get to everyone's question. And so just as a heads up, we'll do our best to get to that Q&A at the end today. But if we don't get to your question or you have follow-up questions, we would encourage you to schedule a 15-minute appointment for one-on-one assistance with the Bureau of Development Services. At the end of the presentation, myself and my colleague Hillary will walk through how to schedule one of those 15-minute appointments. And so if you are an owner or tenant of historic property and you're getting familiar with the new code, we would encourage you to take it to the next step after the overview today of scheduling that 15-minute assistance appointment. So I mentioned we're going to talk about we're going to take this on several different chunks. And so the next couple of minutes, we'll talk about background and context. Then we'll talk about those exemptions to different land use reviews, other code changes, and wrap up with our Q&A. So high level, and again, some of you probably have heard me or one of my colleagues talk about this many times over the last several years, but high level, since 1968, the city of Portland has prioritized the protection of designated historic resources. So for over 50 years, the city of Portland has had a policy priority of identifying, designating, and protecting historic resources. Since that time, over 700 individual landmarks have been designated across the city of Portland, and 25 districts, so larger geographic areas, have been designated and protected for their architectural, cultural, and/or historic significance. Some examples that maybe people are familiar with: Pittock Mansion, it's a city historic landmark. The Paul Bunyan statue is a city historic landmark, as well as a property that's been federally recognized in the National Register of Historic Places. and the Baghdad Theater, which is, again, a city historic landmark, as well as a listing in the National Register. I do want to say a couple things. I think many people probably are here today because you have either an owner or tenant relationship with a district. Some of our city historic districts include the Irvington Historic District, the Lads Edition Historic District, the Alphabet Historic District in Northwest Portland, and the Skidmore Old Town Historic District in the downtown core. We also have city conservation districts. Those are places like Elliott, Piedmont, and Woodlawn that have been designated by the city as part of our historic resources program. So I mentioned for 50 years, historic preservation has been one of a handful of land use priorities for the city of Portland. And our existing regulations and our existing historic resources program, while largely local in nature, is part of a patchwork of city, regional, state, and federal regulations and best practices. Locally, our historic resource protections exist within the zoning code, which many of you are probably familiar with. And those zoning code regulations follow a unique set of state and federal laws that provide both opportunities and constraints in how we apply regulations to historic properties. I'll talk more about those in a minute, but both with our existing code and the code changes that take effect on March 1st, those changes do exist within a context of somewhat unique regulations, especially regulations at the state level. These code changes intend to clarify and streamline the existing zoning code regulations, as well as making sure that our historic resource regulations are responsive, equitable, and effective, both at preserving historic places, as well as meeting the current and future needs of Portlanders. So I mentioned that we've got a unique set of constraints and opportunities. I'm going to talk about a couple of those today that both affect the existing code and the changes that are coming on March 1st. Oregon has a unique in the nation approach to how local governments can and must protect historic resources through their land use programs. Statewide, we have land use goals that apply to a variety of different considerations within the land use world. One of those goals, Goal 5, requires the city to apply protections to historic resources. State law also requires owner consent for the designation of individual landmarks and districts in the future, unique in the nation. But one thing that exists today and will continue to exist is that if you own an older house or you own a older commercial building, landmark designation cannot be applied to that property without your consent. And if you have a property that's within a district, that district cannot be designated at the local level as a historic or conservation district without a majority owner consent. Oregon is also unique in the nation in that state law requires cities to apply at a minimum demolition protections to properties and districts that are listed in the Federal National Register of Historic Places. Some of you may be familiar with the Federal National Register program. It is not part of our local land use program. It's a National Park Service program intended to evaluate, recognize, and honor historic places that have made a contribution to American history or tell an important story in American history. In all other states, the National Register program exists outside of the local land use program. Since 1996 in Oregon, the National Register is honored under state law within our local land use program. So the state does require application of demolition protections to certain properties that are listed in the National Register. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But those unique constraints here in Oregon have long shaped and continue to shape our local approach to how the city of Portland identifies, designates, and protects historic resources. Another thing I want to mention today is because we've had 50 years of experience in historic resource protection and historic resource program, on March 1st, the code changes that will occur are refining our existing approach. Our existing code has been developed over time, learning from lessons of public involvement, adapting to new technologies, responding to best practices nationally. And while these code amendments do make several meaningful changes to how our city regulates historic properties, the existing code and the existing approach is still foundational. So for example, generally, the code amendments are amendments to that existing approach. While there are some new elements and some pretty major changes, The goal of the project has been to refine and improve what already exists, not to start over with whole cloth new regulations. When the project, Historic Resource Project was launched, which is a Bureau Planning and Sustainability legislative land use project that's had the benefit of great involvement from our colleagues at the Bureau of Development Services, a series of value statements were developed and have been amended and refined at each stage of the project. I won't read all of these here today, but in the context of our citywide comprehensive plan, the knowledge we've gleaned from the public participation over the last couple of years, as well as our regional and statewide land use goals and policies, we did seek to advance changes to our regulatory environment that met the challenge of providing a historic resource program that is both more responsive to diversity of histories here in the city, that recognize that existing buildings can and should be adapted for their long-term use and preservation, and that we really want to see the broad community engaged in efforts that would potentially designate or protect new historic places. And ultimately, the ability for historic places to evolve and meet the changing needs of Portlanders needs to be a critical part of how we apply the zoning code going forward. So I've mentioned a few times here some themes in the code amendments. We're going to walk through those today. But in general, under that Oregon approach to historic preservation, historic resources can be considered sort of at a variety of scales. One of those scales is, how do we identify historic resources? What's the process to work with the community, to learn from different histories and to identify what places may be considered historic in the future? We think of that as a survey effort or an identification process that just learns from the community, that collects information, includes that information in a broader inventory of historic places. We also talk a lot about, can we go back, Colleen, thank you. We also talk a lot about designation. Designation is the action of taking an identified historic resource and applying a landmark or district status to it. I did mention that under Oregon law, we do have two unique wrinkles in the designation process. One is a minimum level of owner consent, and the other is a deference to that federal National Register listing. But when we talk about designation, what we're really talking about is the action of applying a landmark or district designation, which conveys protections. And generally in the context of protections, we're talking about design and demolition regulations. We're going to spend most of our time this afternoon talking about protections and the protections that apply to landmarks and properties that are within those districts. In general, and we're going to talk about this more, these code amendments seek to ensure that landmarks and districts that have been locally designated by the city, generally as a result of city council action, receive the strongest level of protection, and those properties and districts that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, not by the City Council, not by our Historic Landmarks Commission, but by the Federal National Park Service, that those designations, those National Register designations, are protected at the minimum required by the state, which is generally demolition protections. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The code amendments also seek to find a better balance between the regulatory constraints that are placed on historic properties and the allowances for adaptive reuse. And so one core element of this project is increasing the uses that are allowed on historic resource sites citywide to allow for adaptive reuse, to provide property owners with flexibility, and to ensure that those historic resources that have diverse and compelling stories are able to be adapted and changed in ways that allows the greatest amount of public appreciation, use, economic viability for those places. And so we'll talk about those adaptive reuse incentives in a minute. And then it wouldn't be a good city project without having an administrative component where staff sought to improve the code for the benefit of applicants, city staff at Bureau of Development Services, and the public, for both understanding our historic resource protection, but also finding the most straightforward code opportunities for projects that go through one of the different historic resource reviews or have to meet certain regulations. And so we did, well, certainly not perfect. We did spend quite a bit of this project looking for ways to improve the code for usability by the broad public. There's a few things I wanted to mention today that are not changing on March 1st. Like I said, the zoning code is going to be changed on March 1st to incorporate the Historic Resource Code project, but there are several things that are not changing. One thing that is not changing is the code is not adding or removing any new landmarks or districts. There's been quite a bit of community interest in both directions, creating new landmarks, creating new districts citywide, and interest in reevaluating some of the landmarks and districts we have today. The code changes establish a new framework for how we'll reevaluate past designations in the future, determining whether or not they're still appropriate, whether or not they're being protected at the right level, as well as create a new process for community engagement and minimum expectations for new landmarks and districts to be created in the future. And so if your property is a landmark today, it will be a landmark tomorrow. If your property is in a district today, it'll be in a district tomorrow. But there is a new framework for how we consider new and reconsider existing landmarks and districts. Another thing that's not changing is we are not changing the official zoning map as it relates to height, floor area, and other development standards. Over the last 5 years, several larger legislative land use projects, such as the Central City 2035 plan, residential infill project, and better housing by design, did amend the allowed height limits, the required setbacks, the amount of floor area in most of our historic districts and for most of our historic landmarks. That process has largely played out over the last 5 years, and we've intentionally sought a better refinement and balance with each of those projects as it relates to development scale within historic and conservation areas. This project is not continuing to tweak that height and FAR map, FAR standing for floor area ratio. However, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, our City Historic Landmarks Commission, other decision makers recognize there's more work to be done on ensuring that our development standards and development allowances in historic and conservation areas are appropriate given their historic status, and also don't unnecessarily constrain the ability for new infill additions and alterations. And so there will be more work on that front in the future, just not as part of this project. And then lastly, we did hear from quite a few members of the public who live in areas of the city that are in historic and conservation districts that have design guidelines that are specific to those historic and conservation districts. It may be 20, 30, and in one case, 40 years old. There has been a lot of interest in refining district-specific guidelines, especially those that are not meeting best practice, that are out of date. We will be bringing forward a revision to the South Portland Historic District Design Guideline later this year, and likely other districts in the future. But this project is not revising district-specific design guideline documents. Next slide. So I'm going to sort of get us into the code specific here. And there's one piece, some of you are already intimately familiar with this, I'm sure others maybe are just learning. One of the core tenets of this project is to ensure that there's a responsive and thoughtful menu of historic resource protection citywide. Many other cities, both in Oregon, nationally and internationally, take a sort of let's call it a gold, silver, bronze approach to how they apply protections to historic resources based upon the nature of the specific resource. Is it architecturally significant? Is it culturally significant? Is it the most important building in the community? Is it a neighborhood importance? And in Oregon, because owner consent, at least at some level, is required for landmark and district designation, new landmarks and new districts will require there to be owner buy-in. And the thought being that a small menu of different protections will both be able to meet the needs of the specific historic resources and the willingness and interest in owners at regulations that will apply to their property. Today's zoning code elevates the National Register of Historic Places to the highest level of protection. These are places that have not gone through a city designation process, but have been listed by the federal government. Applies a medium level of protection to historic landmarks and historic districts that are designated by the city, and implies a lighter level of regulation to conservation landmarks and conservation districts that are also designated by the city. We do have a category of resources, which some of you are probably familiar with, that are called ranked or unranked resources. Those are places that have been identified as having some historic significance, have not gone through the exercise of designation. And so while they're recognized by the zoning code, they have not gone through a formal designation process. Early on in the code project, in response to what we heard from the broad community, not everyone in full agreement, we did take a deep look at how we might restructure that hierarchy of protections that apply to historic resources and how we might streamline that list in a way that is clearer, in a way that is more thoughtful, and that allows for future decision-making to change levels of protection when appropriate for a resource. I'll talk in a minute in the next slide about some of the names, but in general, these code amendments shift us to a place where city designated historic landmarks and historic districts are the most protected resources. City designated conservation landmarks and conservation districts are sort of medium tier of protections, and properties and districts that are listed in that national register are afforded a baseline level of protection as required by state law. And then we're consolidating those ranked resources, what we call ranked resources, into an umbrella category called significant resources. The intent being today we have a relatively long list of different historic resources. That long list is not necessarily hierarchically organized with protections to allow for future decision-making. The code amendments intend to have a simple crosswalk to a new framework. And I think it's important, I want to mention here, if you're a tenant or an owner in a building that is in a conservation district now, on March 1st, you will still be in a conservation district. If your property is in a historic district now, if that historic district was listed before 2017, it will still be in a historic district. Only a small handful of places will fall into this new National Register Landmark and National Register District category. But going forward, places that are recognized by the federal government will fall into that category unless they seek in the future a city designation as historic or conservation. And I know some of this is going to be a little confusing, so I expect we're going to have some good Q&A here in a little bit. But big changes for people just as you wrap your head around this, because it is a little confusing. I think sometimes they think about it as having like a handful of wires that we're rewiring. Just in terms of language that we use, the names of historic resources, the big change is that those historic resources that are rank 1, rank 2, rank 3 that are on the inventory get called significant resources. They're not being designated. They're just getting a new name for consolidation. And historic landmarks and districts that are listed in the National Register of Historic Places, but have not been recognized as historic landmarks or districts by the city, are going to become National Register landmarks and districts. And for those of you who are calling in, this is generally the Laurelhurst National Register District, Peacock Lane National Register District, and a couple of individual landmarks citywide. So unless you're one of those, Peacock Lane, Laurelhurst, you will be continuing to be a historic landmark and historic district. And if you are in a place like Eastmoreland that is pursuing federal National Register recognition, if that federal designation comes true, your neighborhood would be a National Register district rather than a historic district. We're changing that terminology to be consistent, to allow for that thoughtful hierarchical menu of protections, and intending to provide us with a menu that allows a less restrictive approach for new National Register listings going forward. Can you go next slide? So that's background and context. I suspect we'll have some questions at the end about sort of wrapping our head around that from some corners of the participant list. Other people may be tracking right along, so we're going to keep going and talk about what are the brass tacks changes to the city development regulations. Next slide. Okay, so in historic districts, in conservation districts, for historic landmarks and conservation landmarks, we apply and have for a very long time apply a type of design review called historic resource review. I'll use Irvington as my example today as an example of a historic district. So Irvington is a historic district. It will remain a historic district under these code amendments. In Irvington, additions, alterations, and new construction are generally subject to this historic resource review. It's a land use review that intends to protect the architectural and historical integrity of the both historic buildings in the district as well as the district as a whole. Several new exemptions to that historic resource review are included in the new zoning code that would allow the types of projects I'll describe in a second to proceed without triggering that historic resource review. The first one I want to talk about is solar panels. So in historic districts, and I'll use Irvington as an example, but this would apply the same in Ladd's Addition, in the South Portland Historic District, Alphabet Historic District, Kenton. In historic districts, the new code will allow, without review, solar panels, I should say without a historic review, solar panels that are applied parallel to the roof and no more than 8 inches off of the roof surface. So we're thinking about flat PV panels on roofs. Those pitched roofs can face any direction, the street, your neighbor's property, the rear yard, and proceed without historic review. On flat roofs, certain solar panels will be allowed subject to height limitations. This is a pretty significant swing in our regulations where solar panels have been generally limited to the rear facing elevation of properties in historic districts and subject to that review. We're moving into a direction where in historic and conservation districts, we are likely to see significantly more interest and opportunity in solar panels in the years ahead. We do have slightly different regulations for individual historic landmarks. We are carving out new exemptions for solar panels for those individual landmark properties too. But we have a couple more constraints since those individual landmark properties oftentimes have roofs that are historically significant to the building or are more complicated in terms of ensuring their architectural integrity is kept intact. Your next slide. Another big change, and maybe in some ways the biggest regulatory swing towards flexibility in historic districts, is that the code amendments really do open the door for more significant possibilities for accessory dwelling units and detached structures. Again, historic landmarks have a slightly different approach, and so I'm mostly going to focus on historic districts today. So in historic and conservation districts, or I should say historic conservation National Register districts, so any of our city historically designated districts, we are moving in a direction on March 1st to allow detached accessory structures that are 800 square feet or less to be demolished without any demolition protections. This is a big change from today, where in places like Irvington, Ladd's Addition, Laurelhurst, and South Portland, many of the garages and detached structures that exist today are subject to a formal demolition review, which is an extensive process that requires city council hearing. The new code will allow those garages and detached structures to be demolished without any demolition protections. That's about 1,700 garages and detached structures today are subject to that demolition review that no longer will be. So I think primarily Ladd's Addition, Irvington, Laurelhurst, a significant number of older garages will be able to be demolished without any historic review. In their place, we are allowing, through an exemption, certain detached accessory structures without a historic resource review. Today, in a historic district, a new detached structure that's less than 200 square feet is allowed without a review. It's a pretty small building. And so the new code allows detached accessory structures larger than 200 square feet, those up to 576 square feet in size, to be built without historic review if certain design standards are met. Those design standards include window types that are required: wood, metal clad wood, fiberglass, siding that matches the primary building, sidewalls that are no taller than 10 feet, and they must be placed at least 40 feet from a front lot line. So it's a narrow exemption. The idea being smaller detached accessory structures in our historic and conservation districts will be allowed to proceed without review. Anything larger than that 576 square feet, or let's say taller than the height limitations, or using design details that don't necessarily adhere to those standards, can still be approved through historic resource review going through the process. But we wanted to create a fast track process that retains the historic integrity of the place without the time involved with historic resource review. Next slide. Another item that was definitely one of a lot of public interest is windows. We heard from many members of the public that while individual historic landmarks may need the scrutiny of review of any replacement window, we also heard from members of the public that in districts, so historic and conservation districts, that there's an opportunity to allow for more streamlined flexibility for certain window replacements. This gets a little complicated, and so if you do live in a district, you want to take a look at the new code. But in general, if you live in a district and you're replacing a non-original window that's vinyl, fiberglass, or aluminum with a wood or a metal-clad wood window, that is allowed without review. So replacement of most non-historic windows would be allowed without a review. And in the single dwelling zones, even replacing certain original windows with wood or metal-clad wood would be allowed if the building is at least 5 years, if it's a non-contributing or non-historic building, it's more than 5 years old, any of those windows could be changed. If it's a historic contributing building, windows that are facing the rear lot line, even original ones, can be replaced. And then basement windows, including new openings in the basement, could be replaced with this new exemption. So you want to take a look at the exemption if you're looking at replacing your windows, but this is definitely a move towards allowing flexibility, especially in districts, and especially for those windows that are not the most evident from the public right away. Next slide. Perfect. So I mentioned a couple of maybe the more common changes that property owners and tenants in districts may be looking to make. There is a long list of new exemptions to historic resource review for actions like removing an internal service chimney, installing ground-mounted mechanical equipment, certain conduit, utility meters, including EV charging outlets, seismic straps, wall and roof vents in the more commercial areas, projecting signs, and alterations to fire escapes. And so there is a long list of these new exemptions to historic resource review. With a couple of small tweaks, all the existing exemptions are still there. But like I said, we have this long list of work items that will be allowed to proceed without a historic review, primarily in our districts. That doesn't exist today. And so we do know with solar and the detached ADUs, we've been hearing for the last couple of years, there are a pretty long list of people who are ready and waiting for that exemption. I suspect some are on the call today who come March 1st will want to move forward with those solar or ADU projects. Next slide. So a couple more things I wanted to mention, and we're getting down into the weeds here a little bit. Properties that are city conservation landmarks and properties that are in city conservation districts have the option to use a set of clear and objective design standards called the community design standards as an alternative to historic resource review. This is existing policy. This will stay existing policy. There's a few refinements on when those standards can be used. But if you're in a conservation district or you're working on a project in a conservation district, because of that hierarchy of historic resource protections I talked about earlier, because conservation districts are down the hierarchy, just like we do today, we'll continue to allow this clear and objective fast track for many exterior alterations and new construction projects in the conservation level. And then if you remember back to that hierarchy I showed, National Register landmarks and National Register districts like Laurelhurst or the potential for an Eastmoreland Historic District will be exempt entirely from the community design standards and historic resource review. The idea being that we have sort of a gold, silver, and bronze approach to protecting historic resources, with historic landmarks, historic districts protected with that historic resource review, conservation landmarks and conservation districts having the option to follow that clear and objective community design standard approach, and National Register landmarks and National Register districts not having design controls through either historic resource review or the community design standards. And so for most people who are homeowner, small commercial property owner, builder, designer, many of these exemptions are things you're going to want to get familiar with. Many of them provide a fast-tracked alternative to the historic reviews, and something that we hope provides clarity and flexibility where it's been asked for the most regularly in the last few years. So that's all I want to talk about for those exemptions. I want to talk about the other big changes here for a little bit, primarily those that pertain to demolition and those that pertain to use incentives. We rarely see applications for demolition in our designated landmark and district areas. The code will make several changes to that, but we wanted to start out with those exemptions since they're things we see every day. But we'll move on to these other code changes. Okay, so a few things that are changing. I mentioned those exemptions a minute ago, where if you are proposing certain exterior alterations or related new construction, there is a new list of activities that would not require a review. But for those things that still do require a review, such as maybe adding a new dormer, building a larger detached structure that's bigger than that 576 square feet, maybe changing out original windows that face the street, The new code does provide faster and simpler review processes for certain minor alterations. These are things like American with Disability Act improvements, seismic improvement, mechanical equipment signs. We call this the changes to the procedure table. And so for those of you who are familiar with land use reviews, that list of items is subject to a expedited type 1 review. Still does require historic resource review if it's not exempt or in one of those National Register districts. The hope being that those smaller, more routine exterior changes can be processed quicker and can get to approval generally in an expedited fashion. Similarly, for certain major alteration, new construction, and affordable housing processes, we are making amendments to that procedure table specifically to allow a faster and simpler review process for certain affordable housing projects. Generally, these are new construction, but they might be, like some of the recent examples, alterations or additions to historic buildings to create true affordable housing to those earning 60% or less of the median family income. And then a new approach for historic reviews that allow for applicants to revise plans that had been previously approved through historic resource review. This might look like a new infill building that goes through a historic review, and then several months later, there's an opportunity to make some changes to the storefront or make some changes to one of the elevations. The new code allows for an expedited process to revise plans that were already approved. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about demolition regulations today. Like I said, demolition of historic resources is relatively rare, especially compared to alterations, additions, and new construction, which we see every day. But there are some major changes coming on March 1st for demolition regulations. The first change and the most significant expansion of regulation in these code amendments is that all landmarks and all contributing resources, except for garages and detached structures, will be subject to demolition review. And that includes contributing resources, contributing being sort of the historic resources within conservation districts, will be subject to demolition review. And so that's a swing in regulation. So if you have a property in a conservation district, effective March 1st, if it's one of those historic contributing buildings, it will be subject to demolition review. That's a big regulatory change. Staff felt it was a necessary change to ensure that the resource was being protected in the long term, to ensure that our overall hierarchy of protections worked, and also recognize that with some of the refinements that we're making to how conservation districts are treated and opportunities to reevaluate that contributing status, that application demolition review was appropriate and necessary to meet our state obligations to protect those already designated historic areas. Conservation districts are places like Kenton, Woodlawn, Piedmont, Elliott, and Mississippi, so largely in Northeast Portland. And so that is, if you are in one of those areas or you're doing work in one of those areas, just know that there will be a change in demolition regulations there going forward. Can we go back one slide? Sorry. In recent years, there's been a lot of interest or concern from the community about proposals to remove resources from that historic resource inventory. So today's code allows rank 1, 2, and 3 resources that are not designated as landmarks, but are also recognized on the historic resource inventory. The current code allows those ranked resources to be removed from the inventory at the request of the owner. And we've seen a number of these requests in recent years where owners are taking the opportunity to remove that status from their property. That ranked resource status being renamed significant resource status only requires 120-day demolition delay. There's no demo review, there's no design protections. But given the feedback we've heard from the community, effective March 1st, property owners will no longer be able to remove their properties from the inventory without a corresponding demolition application. This is one that has generated quite a bit of community interest. If you have been tracking this closely, any application that's received between now and March 1st to be removed from the inventory will still be processed and allow for removal from the inventory. After March 1st, proposal to come off of that inventory as a significant resource. Again, it's not a type of landmark, it's not a district, it's a place that's been determined to be eligible for that, will only be processed as an application to demolish. And then the last thing I want to mention on this, and this one, again, because they're exceedingly rare, In demolition review, which is that public review process to consider demolition, the approval criteria have been revised. This was one of the city council's one of their last minute changes to the code projects. But if you are thinking about proposing demolition of a historic landmark or proposing demolition of one of the historic buildings in a historic or conservation district, just know that the approval criteria for demolition review will be changing. In some ways, they're getting tighter, so fewer options to get to yes in demolition review. For other types of resources, they're getting more expansive to allow for mitigation, affordable housing developments, and other sort of community-based justifications for demolition. And so if you're thinking about demolition or you're concerned about demolition, you'll want to take a look at those new approval criteria for demolition review. So I want to talk a little more about demolition. This has been one of the more challenging aspects of the code project for staff and I think our decision makers. So I have talked a little bit about how there's historic resource review, or there's design regulations that apply to certain historic resources. I've talked a lot about that hierarchy of historic resource protection. State law requires cities to apply demolition review to designated historic resources. And it requires cities to consider demolition as an action that goes above and beyond just the wholesale removal of a property. And so one of the big changes here, and I think especially for those of you who may be in an area that's considering historic designation in the future, one of the big changes to these code amendments is a historic resource specific definition of demolition. On the right-hand side of the screen here, for those of you who can see it, there's a list of 5 activities that would be considered demolition as it pertains to a historic resource. The first 2 are pretty evident, either total demolition or an alteration that's severe enough that it requires a demolition permit would trigger those demolition protections. So that's familiar, total demolition or a major alteration that requires a demolition permit. But to meet the state definition of what demolition is for historic resources, you'll see there are 3 other triggers for when demolition of a historic resource occurs. That's something I think we'll, for if you're thinking about demolition, you'll have to kind of wrap your head around. One trigger for demolition review would be an alteration that results in the removal of half or more of any street-facing wall of a structure. Another trigger for demolition review would be an alteration that results in 50% or more of the total exterior wall area and the removal of 50% or more of the total roof area of a structure. Effective, sort of in non-code speak, we're talking about half a building or more is being removed. And then for structures that are not buildings, such as the Burnside Bridge or a historic statue, an alteration that results in the removal of 50% or more of the structure. Any of those actions, A, B, C, D, or E, is considered demolition for historic resources. And so it is not just when you're applying for a demolition permit, when you're affecting a historic resource, it'll trigger the demolition protections. It is at A through E list. Next slide. Oh, actually go back. I think I'm just forgetting, I'll say one more thing on this one. One thing I do want to mention though, is if you are proposing a major rehabilitation to a building, that would trigger C, D, or E on this list. And the intent is maybe a seismic upgrade or a restoration project. There is what we call bypass, or we've kind of coined a bypass in the code that says if you're affecting a historic resource and you're triggering that definition of demolition, but what you're really doing is trying to do right by the resource or proposing a change that is not wholly detrimental to the historic resource, the code does allow for an alternative review through that historic resource review or design review for the change. And so a good example of this might be, let's say you have a commercial building in the central city and the front facade was entirely replaced in the 1980s. And you're bringing forward a proposal to reconstruct that historic facade. That action would probably trigger item C on this list. But since the proposal is to do right by the building, the applicant can choose to avoid demolition review and go through a historic review for those changes. Another good example might be if a property is removing a non-historic addition, and that non-historic addition is equivalent to half or 50% of the wall area and 50% of the roof area, that might be an application that would elect that bypass to historic resource review. And so we tried to think through some recent projects that have come in that we wouldn't necessarily consider demolition, that would be more expeditiously and appropriately reviewed through a historic review, and attempted to put those in as bypasses to this definition for those rare instances where a alteration that's not demolition might be proposed. Next slide. One of the core elements of this project, as I mentioned, not just on the regulatory side, is looking for ways to incentivize the ongoing maintenance, repair, and adaptive reuse of historic properties. And so what you'll see on this slide is we have made sort of a, let me rephrase. These code amendments seek to greatly expand the uses that are allowed in historic resources for the purpose of ensuring their long-term preservation, to allow for more community access to those historic resources, and to provide opportunities for continued investment and interest in the historic resources being part of our citywide growth and change over time. In general, historic resource incentives apply to historic and conservation districts and to historic and conservation landmarks. So in general, the incentives do not apply to National Register landmarks and National Register districts. That's largely because those places have not gone through a city designation process. They're not subject to any design controls. It might temper changes that might otherwise come with the new uses. And the incentives are generally not allowed to those significant resources that have not gone through a designation, either as a landmark or district. However, that said, all of our designated historic resource types, landmarks, and districts will be exempt from any on-site parking requirements effective March 1st. And so one incentive that exists across the board for historic resources is we have eliminated on-site parking requirements for all historic resources effective March 1st in order to allow for restoration and adaptive reuse in situations where otherwise required parking may be a burden. In historic conservation districts, so we use let's say Irvington and Piedmont as our examples. The new code incentives for those historic and conservation districts allow residential housing density beyond what was recently adopted in the residential infill project. That looks like no limit on the number or types of housing units within those historic and conservation districts, both through internal conversion of existing buildings and related new site construction. We're also going beyond the residential infill project by allowing in all instances in residential zones 2 accessory dwelling units. Those might be both in the backyard, there might be one in the building and out of the building. And so we're allowing those housing types and densities beyond residential infill projects, including additional accessory dwelling units in historic and conservation districts. The applicable demolition regulations would still apply, as would the applicable design regulations. The idea being that allowing those additional uses provides incentives to owners for continued repair, maintenance, and major rehabilitation. Also, in historic and conservation districts, a very narrow list of low impact accessory commercial uses will be allowed, both in structures that historically had commercial uses or non-residential uses, as well as areas near frequent service transit. In general, we're talking about uses like a small boutique, a tea shop, maybe a record shop in someone's garage, in a basement. We do have a long list of on and off-site regulations to ensure that those uses are low impact and those uses are consistent with the historic sort of physical patterns of the district. For historic and conservation landmarks, so these are individually designated buildings citywide, those same use incentives will be allowed, as well as allowances for major adaptive reuse. When the major adaptive reuse incentive is sought by a property owner, that would require there to be a public review, approval criteria met about the impact of that use on the zone. But the idea being that in recent years, we've seen a number of landmarks or landmark eligible properties demolished or threatened with demolition because the existing base zoning, which almost always was applied after the building was built and first used, provided a significant barrier to financial viability to reuse the structure. And so the idea being here that in rare instances, when individual landmarks need the flexibility for new use to be able to continue to exist and to be economically viable, that having a path for that major adaptive reuse, when it's not generally allowed in the zone, provides a strong protection for those historic resources. Next slide. So I did want to call out a few other things. We're kind of getting to the end here. And so if you're like, fingers are hot and you're ready to start asking questions, now would be a good time to start dropping them into the Q&A. But I did want to call out a few other things here. Like I mentioned, we're not going to get to everything in the code today, but we're hoping to get to maybe the 90% of the changes. So a couple of things. Today in our multi-dwelling commercial and employment zones, we allow historic resources to transfer their unused development potential to other sites. And this is a way of monetizing your opportunity cost of agreeing to landmark designation and agreeing not to redevelop a site to its maximum height and floor area. We have, if these code amendments, attempted to streamline to the degree possible the ability to transfer that unused floor area. This is not allowed in the single dwelling zone. So neighborhood zones, this is not something that happens generally. This is in commercial employment and multi-dwelling areas. So allowing for that FAR transfer to monetize the foregone development opportunity of protecting a historic resource. I mentioned we're eliminating parking requirements for on-site parking for landmarks and districts. We believe we've greatly improved the local historic and conservation landmark designation process. Almost all other cities have long relied on that local designation as the cornerstone for their historic preservation programs. We have an interesting and unique relationship with that federal national register listing. The intention with this project is to really improve opportunities for local historic and conservation landmark designation, since A, owner consent is required, and B, we have histories throughout the city that have not been told through our existing landmarks and districts. And really want to ensure that the city is moving the needle to recognize all histories in our historic resource inventory and to provide the criterion process to allow that to happen. One thing that's a big change too, if you're in a conservation district, as I mentioned, we are applying demolition review in conservation districts where they historically have not had demolition review. That's a big regulatory change. On the flip side, we are providing a new process and criteria for property owners to reconsider or go through a process to reconsider whether or not their individual properties are appropriate for that level of protection. And so this gives a degree of relief for people who are in conservation districts whose properties may no longer be or maybe never were appropriate for inclusion as a historic resource in those conservation districts. And so that's a big change. I think a lot of people in conservation districts who live in buildings that have been altered significantly over time or maybe have little architectural or cultural significance, there is now a process, or will now be a process, for reconsideration of that historic status. And the last change, this is a pretty narrow one. The code amendments do allow for extra height in our commercial mixed-use zones for certain historic resources or for certain sites that are not contributing historic resources. And so this is primarily in Northwest Portland and Northwest 21st and 23rd, allowing for 10 feet of extra height on sites that do not contain historic resources. This is a last minute city council addition, but I do believe there's several projects that are needing this extra height for taller ground floors to better meet the design guidelines for that district. Next slide. So we've gone through background and context, land use review exemptions, other code changes, and I think that probably gets us to a place where we're gonna have a lot of questions. And thankfully, we've got about a half an hour. We'll see if we need it all to answer questions. We get to the wrap up slide. I'm gonna ask my colleague Hillary to maybe pop in and talk a bit about the opportunities for those of you who do own property and wanna talk more with staff in a few minutes here. So can we go next slide? So moving forward, and I'll let Hillary jump in here. Bureau of Planning and Sustainability will continue to work with our colleagues at Bureau of Development Services on our city's Volunteer Historic Landmarks Commission, talking with members of the public about how we can continue to improve and implement, improve the zoning code, implement these changes. Surely there will be some opportunities that get brought up in these new code changes. And so we'll be monitoring that closely as we go forward to see if there's improvements that need to be made in the more immediate future. And next up, I think for those of you who maybe are listening for the South Portland Historic District, we will be bringing forward replacement design guidelines for that district this spring. And so Hillary, I might just turn it over to you to talk about where people can learn more and how they can talk with your team.
Sure, thanks Brandon, great job. So we do have a number of questions in the Q&A and we'll try to get to all of those, but if we don't, and if other questions occur to you later, You can call the zoning hotline at the number there, 503-823-7526. You basically provide the property address and your basic questions, and somebody will give you a call back and have a conversation with you about the specifics of your property and the code that applies to that, and hopefully can answer your questions. You can also sign up for a 15-minute appointment. So that gives you the opportunity to talk to a planner or a permit technician at the time that you choose, and rather than receiving a phone call at some random time. So you can sign up for a 15-minute appointment that's dedicated 15 minutes. You provide the property and your questions ahead of time, and so the planner can look up the code, look up the site, show you the property on a map potentially, and it's face-to-face, just as any Zoom call that you might have been on in the past couple of years. Colleen, do you want to click on the 15-minute appointment link? So hopefully that opened. Thanks. And if you scroll down on the left side of the page, you can see there, meet with city planner. If you click on that, it will take you to an option where you can scroll down just a little bit, please, right there, that blue button. You have your choice of what type of city planner you could speak to. And so for topics related to HRCP, the Historic Resources Code project, you would want to click on Designer Historic Regulations and Reviews. You could also click on General Zoning, but Design or Historic will get you to a planner that will be more intimately knowledgeable about these code changes. And then you can see the potential dates and times in that section right there. So you can set your appointment when it's convenient for you. I think that's all I'll say about those two options. We could probably go to some of the questions in the Q&A now.
Okay, would you guys like me to read those?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. And all right, hang on one second, sorry. Okay, the first question is, our neighborhood of Eastmoreland may be impacted by a designation of a National Historic District. I'd also like to know how immutable these regulations and their interpretation are going forward. To what extent can the city change the rules or definitions in the future? Can the state change its level of involvement at some point, or the NPS? In other words, could Eastmoreland be tying itself to some historic design standards that could change in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So context, Eastmoreland is an area of the city that's pursuing federal National Register designation. The new code provides specificity on how the city will apply regulation to those new National Register districts beginning on March 1st. If Eastmoreland or any other area of the city is listed in the National Register, the city will apply that new zoning code regulation to those National Register districts. But the zoning code can change over time. And so we have no project scope to do that, but much like these code amendments make refinements to our existing designated historic resources, it is almost certain that in the future, there'll be more refinements that could be years or decades down the road. But at present, for the foreseeable future, the regulations that are codified in this HRCP package will be what gets applied to any new National Register listing out the gate. Beyond that, I think it is sort of speculation, since zoning code evolves and adapts, so too does state law, and so too does federal best practice. And so those things might require us or allow us to reconsider these changes at some point down the road.
Thank you, Brandon. The next question is, so ranked and unranked are protected by the new hierarchy unless they are part of a district, correct?
Yeah, good question. Colleen, would you mind sharing your screen and going to the crosswalk slide, which I think is something like slide 5 or 6? I didn't talk about this in great detail, but we have landmarks and districts which are subject to the greatest amount of land use regulations. We've spent a lot of our time today talking about the demolition review, the historic resource review. But that group of properties that today are known as rank 1, 2, 3 and unranked properties in the historic resource inventory are historic types of historic resources. They're not designated as landmarks or districts. And the city isn't throwing away the information on those. We're not, walking away from those. But what we did want to do was to consolidate the regulatory approach to those ranked and unranked resources. And so, Colleen, can you actually go down like 4 more slides? Sorry, to the crosswalk. And so no, keep going. I think it's gonna be slide like 9.
Oh, I'm going the wrong way.
And I see it stuck on slide 5 on my screen.
Oh.
So as Colleen pulls that up, ranked resources will be known as significant resources and subject to 120-day demolition delay as they are today. They'll just have a new name. Unranked resources aren't subject to any zoning regulations today, and so we're going to pull those out of the zoning code. But just keep the information will still be available. That's okay. Go to the one with the crosswalk with the little signs, if you could. For some reason, I thought it was earlier on. There it is. So the significant resources are the rank 1, 2, and 3 in the inventory. They'll still be on the inventory, subject to 120-day demolition delay. But unless they're part of a landmark or a district, they won't be subject to anything other than that delay period. Thanks, Colleen.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Sorry for confusion. All right, the next question is, where can folks go for a list of all the remodeling restrictions as well as ADU building restrictions on homes within a National Register historic district? Same question as to the associated processes and costs.
Yeah, good question. So within a National Register district, this is one that does not have city historic landmark or historic district or conservation district status. So this would be at Eastmoreland, Peacock Lane, potential Laurelhurst, Peacock Lane, or potentially Eastmoreland district. You'll want to look at the new code on March 1st, and you'll want to go to chapter 33.445.220, which describes all the details applicable to National Register district. Once you've done that, you'll want to do one of those 15-minute appointments and learn more about what it would mean for your property. And Hillary, about cost, would you mind jumping on that?
Yeah, and I would, on that question, I would just say that the most applicable remodeling restriction would be probably found in the demolition definition. And then besides that, you're probably looking at base zone restrictions and standards. As to process and costs, unless you're hitting that definition of demolition, you would just need to proceed with a permit. And the costs there, I think they're based on valuation, and you could go to the BDS website for that to talk about your property specifics and what you want to do. And especially to talk about any standards that might apply, like setbacks or height. You could look at those base zone standards and or sign up for a 15-minute appointment.
To put a finer point on it, if that question is from someone in Laurelhurst, Peacock Lane, or Eastmoreland, which again have no city historic landmark or historic district or conservation district status, if you're not triggering that demolition review, then the regulations that Hillary just mentioned would apply whether or not you're in that National Register district. That if you don't trigger the applicable historic resource regulations, which for a National Register district is just demolition protection, then the general requirements of the zone and the building regulations would apply.
Perfect. The next question. Oh, do we have a? I think there's a follow-up question in the chat. Is that a follow-up question? Can you guys tell? The question is, are the historic ranks of 1, 2, and 3 going to be applied to newly designated landmarks after March 1st? Is that a follow-up question to what you were talking about?
I'll answer that. So these rankings were applied back in 1984 as part of a citywide survey of potential historic landmarks and historic districts. Nationally, and from our colleagues at the state, ranking resources like this is no longer best practice. What is best practice is determining if a resource is important or significant, or maybe not so significant. And so the rankings are still going to be part of like the historical information, but going forward, we're going to use the phrase significant resource to determine anything that had been ranked in the past, or maybe in the future gets determined to have significance. If something is designated as a landmark or part of a district, it's, let's say, more regulated or higher on that hierarchy, and so it would not get a ranking. Our hope, I know some of this probably is confusing, our hope is that after March 1st, this whole world of ranked, unranked, rank 1, rank 3 landmark will be much clearer in the code than it has been for the last 30 years. It's going to take us some like rewiring to get there. There'll probably be some, sort of retraining of the language we use, but the idea is we're going to streamline and have a much clearer approach to what these different resources mean and how they can move from one type to another.
Okay, the next question in the Q&A is, in a historic district for contributing structure, can you replace an existing old wood window in the side elevation with a new wood window of same size and operation with a design review and without a design review?
Yeah, so this is a good question. Two considerations. One, it depends on the zone. And so we've offered more flexibility in single dwelling zones. These are neighborhood zones, in part because some of our downtown districts have tall buildings where you can really see the side elevation from a block or more away. And so think about our residential zones. And then second, to the point, there are a couple of limitations on there needs to be a 2-inch gap between the finished material and the window glass, and it cannot be on a street facing elevation. So there are some limitations there. And so I would look to the new code, which you would find in the exemptions for historic districts, and maybe schedule one of those 15-minute appointments to go through it, especially if you're a architect, designer, or contractor who see a lot of these cases.
Okay, the next question is, you mentioned that a larger new ADU must have the same siding as the primary structure. What siding restrictions will there be for homes within a National Register Historic District? Put another way, are there any restrictions that pertain to replacing all or most of the siding on a contributing resource within a National Register Historic District?
Yeah, good question. So if it's a National Register District, only those demolition regulations would apply, and they would only apply if you're removing wall. So in the case of replacing siding, that's not going to trigger the demolition regulations. In the case of new ADUs in the backyard in a National Register District, new construction would not be subject, whether it's an ADU or a primary building, not subject to any design regulations. So we're really just saying, in the National Register District, if you trigger the demolition regulations and you're going to come in for demolition review, if not, the base zone standards, the applicable standards that exist today apply.
All right, the next question. In the past, if a building was listed as a historic list as a not so significant property, the owner had to write a letter asking the property owner be removed from the resource list and then could apply for a demolition permit. If that's still the case, is that still the case if the property is on the city's list and is a type 3 resource?
Yeah, so great question. This would be like a type 3, rank 3 resource that will become a significant resource. And there's no need for a 2-step process. So it would be, if you're a significant resource, you're not a landmark, you're not in a district, you would just come in for the demolition application. That would trigger a 120-day delay period. And then on day 120, you get your demolition permit, as opposed to you're an owner, you come in to remove your property from the list, and then after 120 days, you apply for demolition. So we hope it streamlines it and it is mutually beneficial. One, for the applicant to have a straightforward process when they come in for demo, and 2, for the community to have the heads up at the appropriate time that demolition is proposed, rather than this awkward 2-step request removal and then maybe request demolition down the road.
All right, the next one. Have you looked at altering the inclusionary housing regulations to adapt them to historic districts? Currently, inclusionary housing requirements are the same citywide. However, the main incentive of that policy is to allow for larger buildings. That is typically something that the HLC and other regulations in historic districts discourage or outright prevent. How can you expect new building infill projects to provide affordable housing when they are burdened with very expensive design and material requirements, while they are not able to benefit from the scale offered by inclusionary housing program? In the end, it continues to seem that historic protections have the effect of excluding those of low income.
Yeah, it's a good question. We did not look at the inclusionary housing requirements. A couple of things that have changed here is in regards to new development that's subject to that historic review. There is a new type 1X process for affordable housing proposals to 60% median family income level. That would be a staff level review and could not be appealed locally through our local appeal process. And so the idea being, we do really want to see a diversity of housing in our historic areas. We've seen several great opportunity developments for affordable housing in our historic districts in recent years that we hope as staff that this new type 1 approval can result in a streamlined review process. That yes, there still would be that historic review expectation for the design of the alterations or the new construction, but that the speed at which type 1 review can take place and the limitation on local appeals could provide a more straightforward and streamlined path for affordable housing developers. We did develop that concept in partnership with at the request of Housing Oregon and Catholic Charities of Oregon. So we're hoping that this gives us a better opportunity to see affordable housing built in our historic districts and with landmarks. For conservation districts and National Register districts, we offer the clear and objective design standards option for new construction and conservation districts. And these code amendments eliminate the design regulations that would have otherwise applied or could have otherwise applied in a National Register district going forward, with the intent of not applying design regulation right out the gate with a National Register listing. So I think it's a great question. It's on our mind. Feel free to follow up with me or Hillary to talk more about that. But we're hoping that several of these code amendments do move a needle so that we can be more likely to see affordable housing development in our historic areas.
I'm going to go to the next one in the Q&A. Are there any changes to notification requirements for demolitions?
That is a good question. Not directly. The biggest change would be in the case of conservation districts that will now have demolition review applied to the historic contributing structures, the opportunity for the community to comment on and engage in that demolition review process, including looking for opportunities to mitigate for the loss of the resource, not just on site, but throughout the district, not just architecturally, but for cultural, social, community benefit today and going forward.
All right, the next one. Have you looked at proactively determining the allowable scale for either empty lots and or developable lots in historic districts? Currently, the allowed scale of a building is determined by the subjective judgment of the HLC, and only after much expense and design effort has been put into a potential project. It would reduce risk and therefore cost if an owner had a concrete understanding of the allowable size of a potential new development structure.
Yeah, another really good question. And again, I'm going to focus squarely on historic districts, since the conservation districts allow that clear and objective path without review, and National Register districts would not review new construction. Like I said in the beginning of the presentation, over the last 5 years, the City Council has made numerous changes to the height limits and allowed floor area within our many of our historic districts, Alphabet Historic District, the New Chinatown, Japantown Historic District, the commercial mixed-use zones, the multi-dwelling zones, with the intention of setting heights in relationship to the surrounding historic buildings, but to not overly restrict the height allowed on any specific site in historic districts, to provide designers with the opportunity to sculpt their project, to work within the approval criteria, to look for design solutions that may be taller than the nearby historic buildings. Many of the requests we've heard have been for that sort of straightforward allowed height approach. The caution and concern staff have had about that approach is that we might unnecessarily reduce height on sites where taller buildings may be appropriate, or design responses can get to yes for something that's taller. And so we've tried to find this balance of setting height in FAR a little bit taller than the surrounding historic buildings, with a relative degree of confidence that design teams can get to that height, but to not limit, unnecessarily suppress the ability for designers to build taller, larger buildings. That approach ultimately is part of why we brought forward an amendment at the end to allow that extra 10-foot of bonus height in the mixed use, commercial mixed use zones, recognizing that the potential for bonus height, rather than taking that bonus height potential off the table, would provide opportunities to pursue that additional floor of housing. So I think it's one of these balancing acts. Certainly had a long discussions with the Planning and Sustainability Commission about this with this project. And I think there's a lot of interest in continuing to refine that zoning map to get those height limits and FARs right in historic districts, but nervousness about under zoning the opportunity sites for development, and finding that balance between predictability, but also opportunity.
I'd also like to note that every time a developer brings forth a new building on an empty lot in a historic district, the Landmarks Commission has been pretty receptive and grateful that an empty lot is being redeveloped for a new building. And I would also recommend or highly encourage any developer very early in the process to go through the design advice request process, even if you have essentially napkin sketches with an idea of what you want your building to look like with regard to massing and an idea of skin materials. But that's a good opportunity to get before the Historic Landmarks Commission for early feedback before a lot of money has been spent on design.
One other thing I'll say too is I think there's a piece of this that needs nuance, and that's that new development in historic districts is subject to approval criteria. And those approval criteria are required to be met under our land use program. We did make a few small adjustments to approval criteria for landmarks in these code amendments to maybe allow for a little more differentiation or change. And we are bringing forward updates to design guidelines as capacity allows, with the intent of creating a more clear path for development teams to get to larger new buildings that are still compatible with the district. And so what you'll see with like these updates to the South Portland design guidelines is replacing existing guidelines that require buildings to be no taller than 3 stories with a guideline that looks to encouraging mixed use development types and institutional development types that may be more like a 45 or 55 foot tall building with design details that bring it into compatibility. And so the staff hope is in the years to come, we can resolve some of those challenges that the design guidelines themselves create on development teams and approval.
All right, the next one, under the code, you could conceivably build a 35-foot tall, 16-unit residential structure on any lot in Irvington. Is that correct?
How do I want to answer this? I don't know about any lot in Irvington, but what I would say is in residential zones, we would not have a limit on the number of units. So you could conceivably have a 1 million unit building in Irvington, but that historic resource review and the development standards are going to be the limiting factor on how many units you're going to be able to get into a new development. So the idea being, if you're in a historic district, we've got design demolition regulations. Those design demolition regulations are going to create a form and a box in which any number of residential uses would be allowed. And so the answer to that is conceivably, sure, it could be a 16-unit structure, probably unlikely given the limitations on the amount of floor area in the single dwelling zone.
All right, a few more minutes. The next question is, did I understand Brandon to say that for contributing, non-contributing structures within national historic districts, adaptive reuse standards based on proximity to frequent transit will not apply? Yeah,
so this would be for national register districts that have no city status. So this would be Laurelhurst, Peacock Lane, and the potential for Eastmoreland. if your historic district was created before 2017, then it is a city district. So I want to be really clear about that, that it is only for those districts that have just federal recognition and no city recognition. So if you're in, for example, the Kings Hill Historic District, that is a city historic district and a national district. Because it's got that city status, those adaptive reuse incentives are allowed.
Right, the next one, under the code, any commercial use on the ground floor is allowed on any lot in Ladd's Addition, is that right?
Not quite. So there are parts of Ladd's Addition that are, Ladd's Addition is a historic district. There are parts of Ladd's Addition that are within proximity to transit. And so there is a not insignificant part of the neighborhood that is close to transit. So those areas would be allowed to take advantage of this adaptive reuse incentive, but not any commercial use. So we're talking about uses that are only that allow people of all ages, that are no larger than, I think, 1,000 square feet is where we landed. So limited in their size, that can't result in the loss of housing units on the site. And there can be no outdoor activities after 10 p.m. And the only outdoor activities that are allowed before 10 p.m. are outdoor seating. And so there's a long list of conditions that must be met. And so we're not allowing pot shops, we're not allowing distilleries that are only open to people over 21, we're not allowing the loss of housing units. And so it is a pretty constrained list of the uses that are allowed. In many areas, the Ladd's Addition already allow those commercial type uses. For example, along Southeast Division, Southeast 12th, and Southeast Hawthorne, as well as in the center of the neighborhood, there are, the zoning does allow for some limited commercial uses already.
The next question is, what is the cost for a demolition review?
It's a great question for Hillary.
Yeah, I just pulled up the fee schedule and currently it is $10,368. The fee schedule will be changing July 1st, as it usually does. And we're looking at all of the fees related to historic reviews right now. So I can't say whether or not that will stay as it is or go up or down.
Hillary, could you drop that link into that? Thanks. Here's another one. I can't seem to find the guidelines for new ADU build requirements on the website. Where can I find that link? And I can pull up that link in email also.
Great.
The next question is what if it is in the East Portland Grand Avenue Historic District as type 3?
Great question for one of those 15-minute planner appointments. I think there may be a little confusion here about the type 3 and the rank 3. If it's in the East Portland Grand Avenue Historic District, it is in a historic district. That's a city historic district with demolition regulations that apply to contributing buildings and design regulations that apply throughout the district. Like I said, we have new exemptions, so some things are no longer subject to the design regulations. We've refined the types, so it might not be a type 3 under the new code, it might be a type 2 or a type 1. And so that'd be a great 15-minute appointment question.
All right, the next one is, will you be producing a handout that outlines and simplifies the explanation of the new process with type of procedure, time frame, and application fee?
So a couple things. One, effective March 1st, we'll have our historic resource maps will be updated. Portland maps may take a couple of weeks to be updated. And so for those of you who are, tracking a property, we're hoping to have all that map information up to date soon. We will have the new code effective March 1st. And so our hope is that the new code is clearer, more organized, more straightforward than the existing code. And then once we get a sense of what the regular questions are, where there may be is the need for a handout or clarity, we'll be providing that as we start to hear from applicants and customers what areas need some more clarification. But hopefully the new code is much easier to follow depending on your resource type. For application fees, as Hillary mentioned, the new fee schedule will be live July 1st. And so there are some pieces of the puzzle here that will need that new fee schedule to achieve the opportunities we're trying to achieve with some of these streamlined reviews.
There were a couple questions that were dropped into the chat that we haven't been able to get to, but we'll go through and answer, I'll combine all the questions and we can answer all the questions and we'll post them on the Lunch and Learn website along with the video. So if we didn't get to your question, you can check back there and we'll have it up there within the next week or so.
I did see, Colleen, if I could, I want to answer one just to be,
Sure.
you know, I did see that there's a lot of questions here about affordable housing, and that would be fine to take on more later. And as City Council and Planning Commission had a lot of those shared questions too. One thing I want to say, there was one last question that said, you know, none of the historic review stipulations apply to new non-city historic districts like Laurelhurst. And I do want to clarify that if it is Laurelhurst, Eastmoreland, Peacock Lane, which Eastmoreland is not listed, but in progress, there's a lot of callers here from Eastmoreland. Only the demolition regulations are applicable. And so these design regulations not applicable in Laurelhurst or Eastmoreland. And I did also want to respond. There was one comment dropped in saying the Historic Landmarks Commission has complete power to ignore heights that is allowed by the zoning. And I just want to double down and say that, you know, this is where in historic areas, the state requires us to apply protections. Some of those protections are the demolition protections. But this is one of those areas where the changes to the design guidelines and those approval criteria are really critical to ensure that the reviews are successful and that new development is responsive to the historic characteristics. But I think that's be a great, I'd love to follow up and talk about that and see if you know, you've got an example of something that was arbitrary or was not following the adopted approval criteria. So I'm happy to follow up on that. And I think with that, I know there's a couple questions we didn't answer. Please do take advantage of the 15-minute appointment with Bureau of Development Services. If it's a policy question, again, my name is Brandon Spencer-Hartle with Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Totally happy to talk about some of these policy questions as we go forward. And do take advantage of BDS's knowledge and expertise and look forward to the new code on March 1st. And thanks everyone for coming.
And thank you for coming, everyone.